partly today, which I've never come close to before. Okay. Yeah. Partly today. Okay, I think we're live. Okay. Now let's see, view. I want to make a gallery view. I can do that. All right. I will go back to speakers and then change it. All right. So, hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today is really going to be different. We are going to talk about seaweed, and we're going to talk about seaweed with three experts in very different parts of the world and whose particular take on seaweed differs considerably. I think they do different things with seaweed. So it's going to be quite a thrilling thing for me to bring these people together and see what they would talk about if they were to run into each other at a conference and decide to go have a drink and talk about their various interests in seaweed, because they have quite different interests. So I would like to introduce first in Zanzibar, Dr. Flower. I'm going to turn this on to gallery view so they can see us all. Dr. Flower Ezekiel Msuyu, who is a freelance senior researcher at the Zanzibar Seaweed Cluster Initiative. And she does a lot of work on aquaculture and marine sciences, and she teaches and supervises students, as well as working with seaweed farmers to help them bring innovations into the industry. She is proud of having introduced the habit of eating seaweed in Tanzania and has published a number of journal articles, books, and book chapters. So there we are in Zanzibar, Tanzania. I had to go look it up on the map. It seems that you're on an island. I've never been there, of course. And in Denmark I presume you're in Denmark, because Dr. Ole Moritzen, who is a physicist and a professor emeritus of gastrophysics and culinary art food innovation at the University of Copenhagen. And I've looked at all of the at your CV, sir, and it is really an amazing, eclectic collection of articles in such different disciplines and fields that it's hard to imagine how all of them all go together in a field of gastrophysics, which I have never heard of before, but I'm glad to know exists. And we're going to go to Australia, where Paul Carnell is a senior lecturer at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. Professor Carnell's research aims to support government and non-government organizations to manage, protect, and rehabilitate marine, coastal, and freshwater ecosystems. Now, all of you have in common an interest in seaweed, but you come at it from such different angles that I'll be very interested to see what you have in common. Normally, you see, we start this conversation focusing on the importance of seaweed as a potential way of removing carbon dioxide from the air and sequestering it. And also, we've had a lot of work with conversations about the importance of seaweed as a soil amendment, which is an improved way of improving the quality of agriculture in many places. Soil amendment, and also some sort of elixir or spray that they put on plants to help them stimulate their growth. So, sir, sir and madam, I'd like for you to tell me what your take is on seaweed. Let's start in Zanzibar with Flower. Tell us what your own work is and what you see in common with these other two men. Dr. Msuya.
Thank you very much, Meta. My work is purely on seaweed physiology, seaweed ecology, to look at how the seaweed is helping to bring economic benefits to the farmers and also to the country, to the islands of Zanzibar. So I've been working for many years, looking at socioeconomic and environmental impacts of seaweed farming, how really the farming of seaweed interacts with the environment. And also I've been working, teaching farmers to how to farm seaweed in a sustainable way. Uh, you know, in our country, climate change is a big challenge in the seaweed sector. Uh, I see farmers' livelihood being affected by climate change because seaweed is not growing very well as it should. That's why I came into bringing innovation. When we talk of innovation, in this case, I mean climate smart farming. In my research, I developed technologies that will help farmers to produce more seaweed and to produce high valued seaweed. And because we have two species of seaweeds, one is lower valued. So the lower valued, I teach them to add value to make seaweed products. And the higher valued one, innovative methods that they can use to farm this seaweed. In a nutshell, yes. So I link farmers with research and with the markets and so on.
Mm. What are the things that is of great value? What is the most lucrative product that a farmer could use the seaweed that he produces for?
In this case, we have two aspects. When we talk of a farmer based in Tanzania, based in Zanzibar, based in Tanzania, they are farmers who do not reach like industrial processing of seaweed or industrial sales of seaweed. So in our case, if we compare maybe Zanzibar with sorry, with countries like Philippines, Indonesia, those farmers have direct links to the markets, and they can also work with the processing plants because the most expensive, the high quality product uh, obtained from the type of seaweed that we farm, that is red seaweeds, is carrageenan. Carrageenan, which is a product used in a number of industries, food industry, uh, cosmetic industry, pharmaceuticals, even in textile and so on. So for those who import seaweed from Tanzania, they extract carrageenan from the seaweed and is used in this a number of these countries, and it is quite expensive. It goes all the way up to $600 per ton. But when we talk of a farmer in Zanzibar, a farmer in Zanzibar produces seaweed, there are two ways: only to sell to the exporter who sells, and the farmer doesn't have anything to do with the carrageenan that is extracted outside the country in France, USA, Denmark, and so on. So the farmer in Zanzibar uses the seaweed to make seaweed products, food products, cosmetic products. Cosmetic products, we talk about soap, we talk about lotion and all kind of products, hair oil and so on. Food, we'll talk about jam, juice, cakes, and this kind of products that they can use directly at home or sell in nearby markets.
Thank you. That's very interesting to me. Yeah, okay, let's go to Denmark now. And Professor Olitz, Meritzen, can you give me a better picture of what you do? Because it seems that you do physics and you do chemistry and you do all kinds of very things that I'm not familiar with. But you're into food, and I got that much.
I'm happy to tell you about it. I've been interested in seaweeds for more than 20 years. In my country, it's a weird thing because we don't have any tradition in historical times for eating seaweeds. There's
Mhm.
some uses of seaweeds, for instance, processing of seaweeds, which also Flora is measuring for carrageenan and agar. The big picture for me is that if you look at the organic production on the planet, it's mostly based on products from algae, small algae and big algae, and there are 12,000 different kinds, and they are in all climatical belts. So it's a big thing. And
So wait a minute. I think for me, isn't it true that seaweed is algae?
seaweed
All seaweeds are algae. Is that true or not?
Seaweeds, algae, and seaweeds are what we call macroalgae, that is multicellular organisms. Of course, they're more of the small algae, but the macroalgae, which is the topic today, there's about 12,000 species, and they grow very fast. And as I guess you mentioned just earlier, they bind carbon dioxide, and because they do photosynthesis, they are responsible for part of the, or large part of the oxygen on the planet. And over historical times, seaweed has been used, come in as a rescue all through times for humanities, whether it's at wartime or during famine, as food, as all sorts of technical purposes. I'm interested in food, and I think food should come first because that is the critical thing in the green transition. And it's a little bit boring that in some of the major international reports, for instance, the Eat Lancet report, algae does not appear at all. When we talk about food, the important thing for me is when it comes to sustainability, we should remember that no food is sustainable or nutritious or healthy before it's eaten. And this is where taste and the sensory perception of seaweed comes in. And this has been my interest for a number of years, how the different taste and also aromas and also texture of seaweeds is very important in order to have more people eat in a sustainable way. And of course, the reason why seaweeds are relatively sustainable, and in particular in the farm situation, is that they are at the very bottom of the food web. And that's why they are the most efficient way of using sunlight and the nutrients in water to produce macromolecules. And some of them extremely important, we can only get from algae, and that's the polyunsaturated fatty acids, which are so important for our coronary and heart system, but also for our brain and neural system. But that's sort of a separate thing. So seaweeds have everything to speak for them in terms of the nutrients, lots of nutrients. They're healthy in many aspects, and then they can also be farmed sustainably. But there's something that is needed in order, at least in that part of the world where there's not a tradition for eating seaweed, to teach people how you use seaweeds in the daily kitchen. This is something I've been working on for years. So I'm focusing on taste and the sensory perception. And in the small picture here, that's actually going right down to the community. And some of the things I've been involved is a sort of community building using the sea, which is quite often overlooked in certain parts of the world, the sea as a resource for future food. And I've been quite engaged for almost 10 years working with children and young people to teach them about seaweeds and teach them how valuable resource this is. And of course, also teaching people, the general audience, the general public, about how you can actually cook with seaweeds. So this is where my
Well,
interest.
tell us, I want to come back anyway and get a good recipe because I've experimented a little bit on my own. I like this, what is it, wakame salad, the greenish stuff that in Japan you get salad with sesame oil and sesame seeds on it. And I probably have some in the fridge now because I order it every week. But that's the only kind of seaweed. No, that's not true. There's also this black thing that you wrap these little sushi things in. it was very thin, paper thin sheets.
Most people know that from the sushi because it's used to make the maki sushi roll sushis, and in fact it's quite interesting because the reason why that was originally developed as something to eat with rice is it provides umami, and that will help you eat more, in this case, more plant-based food, which is rice, but that could be used in a much more general sense. I know very well the wakame salad because it's a commercial product. It's from a large brown seaweed that is blanched and salted and then added with certain different kinds of dressings, and then people kind of like it. I think they like it because of the texture. But if you, for instance, have access to bladderwrack, which is completely overlooked, but there's lots of bladderwrack just at the seashore, you can blanch that as well. I mean, drop it in hot water. Now you're getting a recipe.
Okay,
Put it in
I'll
hot
take
water
note.
and then in cold water, and then you have a wonderful texture of bladderwrack. And so one can use many different species. So, but in most countries, apart from of course those countries that still have a historical record for using seaweed, and certainly in Southeast Asia and Polynesia, it's something that, I mean, people eat maybe 50 to 100 different kinds of species, and you and I, we may only talk about one, or and only get seaweeds indirectly from delationate.
Well, do they differ a lot in taste? I mean, if they are all similar in taste, then by trying out one, I might have reached a reasonable conclusion about what the others are going to taste like. But
No,
maybe I haven't been fair enough to experiment enough.
It's just I usually compare to when people ask what is the taste of seaweeds, and then I say, well, what is the taste of plants? Because the difference between different kinds of tomato and some kind of grain or carrot, and they're very different. And so are the 12,000 different kind of seaweeds. So there's a huge difference. So we can't just not say seaweeds. We have to sort of specify what kinds they are, and they have vastly different tastes and textures. There's one interesting example when it comes to taste, because most people know what is called the fifth basic taste, which is umami, which is actually, in my picture, my universe of the green transition, that is the most critical basic taste we have to learn about in order to make more green, for instance, more green food delectable. That was discovered from an extract of a brown seaweed from Japan called konbu, which is the base of all Japanese soups, dashi, and more Western kitchens are also using this. And it's very rich in a compound that provides umami taste.
Okay. Well, I want to come back to you and get some recipes. Let's go to Australia now and find out what's going on there. Your work is quite different, isn't it, Paul? You're working trying to look at the environment more than the seaweed itself. Is that correct? Tell us about your work.
Yeah, I guess I work across a lot of different ecosystems, but yeah, particularly in the coastal space from, mangroves, salt marshes, seagrasses, but yeah, a particular passion and love in the seaweed and in the kelp space. And I guess that covers a couple of different aspects from, the ecology and the management of these species, particularly kelp forests, which are, amazing underwater forests. I'm home to tremendous biodiversity, but we're seeing a lot of loss of those ecosystems with global warming and a range of other pressures as well. And so how can we better manage them and then also try to restore them for all of their amazing biodiversity value? But the other reason that they're really important is they actually do a lot for us. And we term this ecosystem services, which I'm sure many of you might be familiar with. And so this is because they produce things like fish, so that contributes to fisheries. But also, obviously, we're talking about people consuming seaweeds and kelps as well. They cycle nutrients, they store carbon. And so we can actually not just look at the biodiversity benefits of these amazing ecosystems, but we can actually then look at all that they do for us, and that's part of the economy and the economics that are reliant actually on these ecosystems. And part of some work to actually, well, try and put some dollar figures on that. What are these ecosystems worth to us in some of these goods and services? And that's to really drive that better management and protection of these ecosystems. And just like the other people here have been talking about, there's so many different seaweeds. I've got just in southern Australia is a really seaweed biodiversity hotspot. And if you want to ID a seaweed species, there's about 6 books that stack up about that high. And you have to go through those to try and figure out what particular species that you have. And the red seaweeds here are really particularly diverse. There's 4 books just for here, just to try and identify those. And then there's one for browns and one for greens. So yeah, there's a lot of amazing species. And just to the question around, what do they taste like? 100% agree. They're all so different in texture, in taste, in size, what they look like. And
do
so
you eat it yourself? Do you eat seaweed much?
yeah, bits and pieces. So yeah, there's particular species. There are some that are better, to pick fresh and to put into salads. Others that are better, to try and pickle or something like that. So, and that's definitely
I don't think we would get any fresh seaweed at any markets around Toronto, where I live. I mean, I get this wakame salad with sesame on it. And you can buy sheets of those things for wrapping up sushi nori things. But I don't think you can get anything that's fresh from here, because we don't have seaweed around in the lakes here. Although I understand it's really growing gangbusters in the Arctic. The cold water is not not stopping them at all. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, in Australia, it's definitely a developing industry and market. And yes, it's certainly difficult to go and buy Australian grown seaweeds here. We do have the wakame species that grows in the wild, but that's actually been introduced. So it's actually a bit of a pest down here in Australia.
Oh.
And so I've done some research on some of the impacts that it has, or and how we can actually better manage that particular species, which is actually a pest. And in some cases, obviously people are then saying, well, maybe we should be trying to harvest it, and that's maybe a way of trying to get rid of it. But yes, we have other local species, yes. But that's probably something more that me, myself, knowing a bit about seaweeds, I'm going snorkeling or diving on the weekend and then actually collecting some of these. But yes, we've got a growing seaweed industry here in Australia, but definitely nothing to the likes of Southeast Asia.
Okay, good. We've had several conversations about seaweed, not just mostly one whole session to itself, but in connection with other conversations about how to capture and sequester carbon. And there's a guy named Brian von Hertzen who's he lives in Australia, and he's promoting the idea of having giant seaweed. I guess you'd call it farming, but my guess is that it's not like the kind of farming that Flower's friends and people in her area are doing. I don't know. I want to find that out. But he talks about having big mile square frames or platform kind of things, and bringing upwelling from the bottom of the ocean, pumping up water, which will be nutrients for the seaweed that he grows there. And he talks about how that then part of it, about a quarter of it, falls off into the ocean and sinks to the bottom and sequesters carbon. But a good part of it then becomes food for fish, so that there are large areas of the ocean that are no longer home to significant fish. And so it would very much improve the livelihood of fisher people and the amount of food that we could provide for the world by producing this. Now, is this a far out idea? I know it's a far out idea, but is it so odd that none of you have been working on anything that in any way resembles that? or does it, and I want to ask Flower first about that, would you talk about helping local farmers, seaweed farmers? I presume, well, tell me what they do and how it compares to this ocean farming idea.
Thank you. Okay, the one you are describing is upwelling, using upwelling, artificial upwelling, we can say, to bring up nutrients that are at the bottom, and then make the water more with more nutrients, and then growth of the seaweed is enhanced and so on. So in our case, in the case of Tanzania, we don't have these large waves like where you can have really upwelling. The Indian Ocean on this side, the Western Indian Ocean doesn't have really those like upwelling large waves that can really mix a lot of water and the nutrients to make this. I remember there was this his company's Hessen or something, his name. He wanted to try this in Tanzania. I have to remember his name. And we talked about it, and then later he saw that it was not really feasible in Tanzania. So he went to do it, I think, if not in Indonesia or Southeast Asia somewhere. So in our case, the farmers are now, we have trained the farmers after developing this deep water farming. But deep water, we mean something like 6 to 10 meters. I mean 2 to 6 meters, or up to the maximum of 10 meters. It's not much depth. So so in our case is not to move, because if we say to move, it means we abandon the shallow water, because seaweed is farmed both in shallow water and deep water. Deep water is innovative technologies that we are developing and encouraging farmers to use to farm in deeper waters as well, because of the effect of climate change. Temperatures are increasing over the years, and we find a lot of diseases and the epiphytes and pests. So the seaweed is really very much affected. And for example, our farmers are failing to farm one seaweed, which is because we have we can say two types of seaweed that we are farming, and the one called cotonou or Copperficus, the price is actually double that of the other species, but they cannot produce because this species is very sensitive to temperature, and the temperature are increasing over the years. So in the shallow water areas, this species does not grow anymore, as it used to in the past 15 or so years. So we are training them to farm in deeper waters so that they can produce the higher value seeds. Yeah. So in our case,
well, I don't have any idea how you farm. I mean, farming to me is in dirt. So I don't understand even the notion of really farming seaweed. How do you farm something like that? And does it vary, or is the technology of farming seaweed the same everywhere in the world, or with all different species? Tell me more about what a farmer would actually do to plant or to harvest or to maintain the growth of a particular seaweed for market.
Yeah, that's a very good question, because I'm from Kilimanjaro. My home area is near Mount Kilimanjaro. That's where I was born and grew up. So in those years, in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, when I was telling my parents that there's seaweed, you tell them there's seaweed and there are people farming seaweed in the ocean, they were like, it's totally different. The case of seaweed, for example, there are different methods depending on the area, depending on the environment. For example, the methods used to farm seaweed in Zanzibar may not necessarily be the ones that we can use in Scotland, because it depends on the area. So how seaweed is farmed? in the case of Zanzibar, seaweed is tied in nylon ropes. So they take the nylon rope and then they tie seaweed bunches or branches along the rope, and then it is extended and tied between two wooden pegs. So it is horizontal on the surface, and it is mostly done in shallow water areas. Some of them would have these lines, but they would be long and they'll be not at the bottom, but hanging somewhere in the water column. Now it depends on the area, the place itself. For example, in Tanzania, we cannot use the long lines used in Philippines or Indonesia, for example, because their seas, their oceans are much calmer. So they can put the lines in the water column and then they produce the seaweed. In our case, we cannot because the sea is very rough. So farming means placing small branches of seaweed in a device. If it is a rope, or if it is a raft, maybe of bamboo rafts, or if it is in a cage, and so on, and then letting it grow. With time, then the branch increases in size, and then after some time, it is harvested. Like the red seaweed is harvested after 45 to 60 days. So yes, farming in the ocean is quite different, and it depends on where they are located, and actually also the type of seaweed. The red seaweeds that we are farming, the cotonia and spinosum, for example, eucumatoids, Capophycus, and the eucuma, they are small. They are smaller seaweeds, not large like the kelp, not like laminaria or so. So those very large seaweeds, like those farmed in Europe, for example, the farming is different from farming in the small ones, like in shallow water areas, like in Zanzibar.
Okay, thank you. Getting a little glimpse of it. I want to invite you folks to interact as you would with each other to find, surely you have common interests or concerns. And so if you were to bump into each other at a conference someplace, what would you want to talk to each other about? So I'm going to step back and not be the interviewer and just hope that you can each share your or ask questions and comments of each other. Who would like to question somebody else or comment? Yes.
I would like to start with just two comments. One about the seaweed farming. I mean, one should realize that 95% of the seaweed on the world market is farmed, and most of it is out in Asia. And the techniques, as Flower mentioned, is very different from different species. And there's still a lot of development that need to be done. But the two major crops on the market, that's Pyropia, that one that is used for nori. That's the most valuable, single most valuable seaweed product. And the other one is konbu, the Saccharina japonica, that is used for Japanese soups and also other food stuff. And that's extremely valuable crop. And in principle, the farming is simple. You seed ropes or nets with the spores, and then let them grow in a tank, and then you put it offshore. And all these species are grown. I don't know if you call it deep water, but they're certainly from 5 to 10 meters where they're grown. Offshore, really offshore, is really a big channels, because if you have to have installations out in water that is sufficiently nutritious for the seaweeds, that it'll also be quite violent and turbulent waters. So that will be difficult to do offshore. But most of the seaweed produced is really near land, and some is actually anchored to the ground. And seaweed just needs a holdfast. It doesn't have any roots, so you can basically live on anything. You can attach it. For instance, the way you do it in Zanzibar. The other comment I had, that was about freshness of seaweeds, which I think is an important thing, because I mean, Meta, you seem to indicate that most people may not know many different kinds of seaweeds, and then they will ask for fresh seaweeds. But the lesson from Asian cuisine, both Chinese and Korean and Japanese cuisine, is that you go for dry seaweed. And this is the reason why this is, there are several reasons why it's gastronomically more interesting. But because seaweeds are very simple organisms, if you dry them under controlled conditions and put them back in water, I mean, you have to be a biologist to tell they're not alive. So this is very different from drying a tomato or some other plant material. It would not swell and look like it was before. So the best way to teach people to use seaweed is actually just tell them, you just get it dry. And then it's quite a different matter of getting hold of it, because when seaweed is dried, it loses maybe 80% of its weight, and it has long storage times. Some of the seaweeds can be stored for 2, 5, 10 years. In fact, some of them are actually aged up to 10 years. So you can easily have it and in a convenient way. So I think this is an important point of view if you want to teach people to use seaweeds. That is, that you just have the dry seaweeds. And some of the tastes are also getting more mellow when you dry it. And that's also, at least for some people who don't like too marine aromas, this is good news. And also the nutrients, they actually are well preserved during drying, as long as you can keep them dry and usually in the dark. The question I would like to ask to my two colleagues on the screen, that is, how do we, with different knowledge from different parts of the world, different food cultures, how do we get a broader interest in using seaweeds in our daily diet, for the reasons of both sustainability but also for health, and how do we do this in a way such that we sort of remove the challenges that some people will have when you tell them about some food stuff they may never have heard about, and usually think that's probably not something you can actually eat. So how would you do that in different countries? And I could maybe ask Flower, I guess in Zanzibar, you don't eat the cotona just as it is. You may, is it used for delasing agents, or do you actually, and I know in some parts of Japan, some of the red seaweeds are actually used to make some kind of porridges or gel cakes where you actually eat the raw seaweed or cooked seaweed. Is it a common thing in Zanzibar to actually eat the seaweeds, whole seaweeds?
Okay, thank you. I'll tell you that we didn't have a tradition of eating seaweed, not in Zanzibar, not the whole of Tanzania. I would say not even the whole of the Western Indian Ocean. So you can imagine, as you are saying, to tell people about food, something to eat something that they have not eaten before and they have not seen anyone eating. They will look at you as if you are saying something that is very strange. So this is really what happened to me when I was starting to, in 2006, when I started to tell people that they can eat seaweed. I remember even one man, middle-aged man, looked at me and said, "Young lady," I was young then, "Young lady, why should I eat seaweed? Don't I have food?" You know, it's something that is strange to people to eat seaweed. But then we say that people usually want to see. When they see, they learn. So slowly, when we started to make these products and to show people how to make different products, how to use seaweed, that is when they actually started to think, oh, this is possible, and then it continued. But also I have to say that we use seaweed not only to make like soap or juice or whatever seaweed. We have also trained people to actually cook seaweed like a vegetable. They take a seaweed if it is fresh or dry, and then it is made just like a vegetable. So they can make that one. And if seaweed is dried and ground into powder, people can even just eat consume the powder or put it in juice or in tea, in all kind of food. So it seaweed and when it is also when it is cooked, it can be dry or fresh, as I said, but also we have trained them to make salad. So they make salad from both fresh seaweed and dry seaweed. So as you had said, my friend before that, you take the dry seaweed, you soak it in water, and then it just swells as if it reaches the size of wet seaweed. So you chop it and just make salad. So different ways of using the seaweed. So I think when we start slowly in our own places, we say think global and act local. So locally, you do something small in your country, it has a large impact with time. So I think that if we continue to tell people, continue to show people, speak about eating seaweed, natural food from the ocean, I'm sure people it will gain more and more popularity.
I like
Maybe
this notion of powdering it, because then you could put it in with food. If you weren't used to it, maybe you could add a little bit at a time to other foods and get used to it, maybe. I've never had that. Ole, tell me what would be the most promising, I imagine that if you started off by giving people the most delicious dish that you can think of making from seaweed, then they get through a hurdle and might try other things. But what would you say is the most that people enjoy the most? What dish made from seaweed would be a good starter?
it would be
Uh,
definitely something with focus on the umami taste. But maybe to start on the very simple level, I think, Mata, you have got the point that one should use seaweeds in dishes people already use on the daily basis. For instance, I use seaweed every day, and it could be in an omelette. You could use it as a spice. You can use it as a salt substitute. You can put it in bread. And depending on which seaweed and how much you put in, you get different flavors. Sometimes you don't even realize it's in there. So you should think of the dishes you like, and then you may add them and then sort of crank it up. But again, the focus is on it is on taste. And so if I may ask Paul, because the indigenous people in Australia, they had tradition for using something like, nori, the seaweed for nori, and the Australian scene, gastronomical scene. You have seaweed chefs, and they discovered that the borders around Australia is extremely rich, as you mentioned, in seaweeds. And I sort of read and understood is sort of coming in on the high-end restaurants. Now, the question is how it sort of trickles down. Do you have any knowledge about that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, and and it's great that you pointed out some of the indigenous uses. So it's definitely there's kind of a story of different cultures, and I think so the Aboriginal Australians, the original people here, had a long, particularly the people on the coast, had a long, rich history of consuming seaweeds. And I have some other colleagues that doing a lot of research working with those traditional owners and their uses, whether it was to make water carriers with some of the really thick kelps, to actually then to eating them. But yes, obviously for the European settlers that then arrived in the last 200 years, which is more the kind of British UK type diet, it wasn't obviously a big part of that. And so, yes, like you say, it seems like this strange concept when for most people, their interaction with seaweeds is they're walking on the beach and there's this rotting stuff that's washed up, and it's probably the least pleasing aspect to come across. And I think that's the challenge, that people's interaction with it on a daily basis is often when it's washed up, and it's kind of decomposing, as opposed to when you get under the water and you see it and it's alive, and just how amazing it is. And then, I guess not having that appreciation of, just like you were saying, Ole, that, this is something you can just work into your everyday food and diet. So I think, yeah, as that knowledge starts to come out, and yeah, a lot of people, I guess, starting to spread that word and the uses and the benefits, that's
Now,
yeah.
if I can ask about
Slowly
gathering
down.
seaweed, because one of you said that 80 or 90 more percent of the seaweed that people use is farmed. And I was quite surprised to hear that because, this stuff grows everywhere. Is it difficult to harvest if you found a big overgrowth of it? For example, I understand the Hudson Bay is very, overgrown with seaweed now, or kelp maybe. And but they don't use it. They're not. There's no tradition of eating it. Uh, I was thinking it would be a good alternative source of income for the indigenous people living on the shores if they could harvest that and perhaps make it into dry it or something and make it into something that could be exported and used either as a soil amendment or food or maybe cosmetic as flowers suggest. But is it a practical thing to go out and harvest naturally growing rather than farmed seaweed? Could you make an industry that way?
A lot of small industries all over the world on coastal lines. And some are indigenous people who have certain rights to harvest in a certain area. I know that's the case in the western coast of North America. So there are many of these little cottage industries, but the trouble here is to sort of market it and getting it sold. I think the internet has helped something, but maybe to give an example, in the United States, all along the West Coast and way into British Columbia, you have these giant kelp forests. There's something called bull kelp with these huge splatters and macro kelp, which you mostly just hear about because sea urchins munch on it and sea urchins fight with the otters and things like that. All of this seaweed, all of that is harvested ends up in the industry to turn it into alginate. That is a component of brown seaweeds that is used for delacing purposes. Is what we call a hydrogel. Just like the red seaweed from Tanzania and other places is used to extract carrageenan, that is used also as a delation agent, for instance, in the dairy industry. So there are small companies along the coast and the west coast of the US who are actually harvesting wild sources of these two species, and none of them are grown. I mean, there are lots of it in the water, and I think we should think of a way of at least using some of it for foodstuff. A similar thing is true in the northern part of Europe. Norway is one of the largest producers also of alginate, harvesting different kind of brown species around the coast, the North Atlantic coast, and the whole basin of in the North Atlantic around Iceland and Greenland. They are some of the world's richest sources of seaweed because they're cold water and very nutritious water. But
But
it's
excuse me, but you use the word alginate. I'm not familiar.
Seaweeds have certain compounds that are carbohydrates, that is complex sugars. We also call them, when we eat them, dietary fibers. They don't provide any energy, but their purpose in the algae is they bind water, so they keep cells together, and we can extract them. And there are three different kinds, well-known kinds. There's from the reds, carrageenan, for instance. You'll find that in most yogurt nowadays. And there are agar that is used in various different industries, also food industry, and then alginate, which is used as a hydrogel, and is also widely used. And this is where most of the seaweed, or at least more than half of the seaweed harvested, that's where it goes.
It's like a gel, is that it?
For gelation, yes. And it's very good at it, and it's something that I think most vegans know, because when they want to have a gel, they are not supposed to have gelatin. Then these different extracts from seaweeds is something that you can take advantage of. So if you want to develop eating of seaweed, we should first of all learn to use the harvested species, the wild species. We use some of that for foodstuff. But if you're really going to scale up, there's no way around farming, and we have to farm also in order to do it in a sustainable way, and also in a way that is ecologically something you can defend ecologically. And I'll just mention something where there's been experiments in Canada over the years, that is to provide some kind of ecological systems where you have seaweeds in farms together with fish, together with filter feeders like blue mussels, and they each can thrive. They eat their excess nutrients, and they all thrive. And this is the way we should imagine future aquaculture. That is, that we should have different species that lives together in a kind of ecological niche, and that's the way to go. But one has to be very careful. Protecting the marine environment and the people that lives along the shores and live off the sea, that you do this in a sustainable way.
Yeah,
there's also
a lot of great research happening, around multi-trophic aquaculture is a term that gets thrown around, and I guess that is particularly because of some of the nutrient impacts from the fish farms. So in places like Norway, here in Australia or elsewhere, where they have really big fish aquaculture farms that have a lot of nutrient problems. But that's why seaweeds are so amazing, because they draw in all of those nitrogen and other things so they can help balance that out. So that's definitely a big area of research at the moment. The other one I did just want to jump back to quickly was around the notion of the kind of wild harvesting, and just like Ole said, there's a number of examples of kind of smaller industries. And I think probably the other thing to be also careful of a little bit is, even though we kind of have this notion of that the oceans and our seaweeds are kind of forever bountiful, kind of plentiful, but there would be a sustainability aspect too. So, where there is wild harvesting, also making sure that then that you're not over harvesting. So, I definitely think Ollie's right, and obviously the work that Flower does, that farming for seaweeds really is the way to go, particularly if you're talking about scale.
I'd like to ask about the discovery that certain kinds of seaweed, if fed to cattle, dairy cows, for example, or any ruminant animal, will reduce the enteric exhaling of methane. And I read recently that up to 90% of the methane that is being produced from these animals could be removed or reduced by 90% if under optimum conditions. Well, now, all around the world, there are farmers and ranchers raising cattle, and I would have thought that most of them don't have anything like access to seaweed. I'm sure it's a very particular strain of seaweed that they would need. Well, Olia was saying something about it can be dried, and if it's reconstituted, it's got everything in it that it had. So it sounds to me as if you could get this kind of seaweed, make a good industry of it, and dry the stuff and ship it around so that cattle ranchers and farmers could slip a little bit of it into the fodder that they're feeding their animals. Have any of you thought about that, or is there any move in that direction?
If I may come in. Yes, we have this species called the Asparagopsis. Depends on if it is taxiformis or something. It cuts more than 90% of the methane, and it is a new idea, and it is being experimented. We have an institution in Australia, in Australia, where they are doing this, and even in Tanzania, from literature, we have already seen that we have Asparagopsis taxiformis, which grows naturally. So I think it's a matter of doing research to see if this seaweed, how this seaweed can, what are the methods that can be used, and then actually copying from what Australians are doing, this large-scale experiments, and then we see. But it is a very good opportunity to use this seaweed to cut this methane emission.
You mentioned the sargassum. I don't remember the word sargassum or something. I've heard of these big floating, awful, nasty stuff in the Atlantic that it washes up on beaches and is a terrible problem. Is there any good use for that? Could we make that into something worthwhile and quickly enough start up an industry to do it before the stuff, well, while it's a real problem? Has anybody thought about how to do something constructive with that mass of whatever it is? Anybody? Maybe I'm asking a question that there's no answer to.
No, there's an issue. There's an issue with the sargassum. Many sargassum species, they have natural amounts of arsenic. And so there's usually something that makes it a little bit difficult for using as human foodstuff. I don't know about what you mentioned at washing ashore, what the actual issue there, but I know it's something that it's not the first seaweed species I would start telling people to eat.
Well, I've heard that, the things are hundreds of miles long, big floating mass of gunk that's nothing but trouble now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's different components to that. Like, I've definitely seen work people have been doing looking at the carbon sequestration capacity of that, because it's out there and it's floating. And then I guess it's also providing home, maybe to fish and things as well. So, it's probably just on the unfortunate circumstances when it washes ashore that maybe it's causing a bit more of a problem. But sorry, Flower, I think you were going to jump in and say something as well.
Yeah, I was saying that it is true that sargassum is actually a problem. It blooms a lot in many areas. Just wash at the beach, and after some time it rots, and then it smells and whatever. It's not a nice scene. It's not a nice thing to see. That sargassum is mostly used in that one can be converted into fertilizer, maybe to grow food, but there are some small uses there where people actually make sargassum powder, and but then as Paul said, there's a lot of arsenic and so on, these heavy metals in sargassum, which if it is used as food, we have to really assess how much is there, what if there are species that have less, or how we can lessen the amount of these heavy metals in the sargassum.
Well,
sorry. I was just going to jump back as well and just talking about the red seaweed that reduces methane from cows. And it's definitely a great idea, and there's a lot of potential. And I think, now it's kind of moving into like, how realistic is this? And that's probably in a couple of senses. So like, basically, how much does it cost to grow that seaweed, and then to give it in enough amounts that then you can feed it to those cattle and so it does, and so we're starting to see some numbers on that looks like it's maybe borderline whether it's financially kind of feasible for farmers potentially. And then I guess the other one is it really depends on the type, or the way that those cows are being reared. And so in a lot of areas, they're kind of like rangeland, so where the cattle are grazing over quite large areas. So the notion of, I guess, trying to bring them into a specific area, like feedlot type style that you can then add it in, gets a bit trickier. But whether it's dairy or something where you have more ability to kind of obviously be able to add that to their food, then that's a little bit easier. So there's certainly a little bit more complexity to that potential solution, but it's definitely one that is really worth looking into just because of the degree of methane emissions from livestock across the world.
Okay, well, to be continued. This is certainly only scratching the surface of a very important topic. So I'm going to go and see if I can. Ole, send me your recipe, your favorite recipe, and I'll absolutely cook up a dinner for my friends, and I promise. Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate this, and I expect that other people are going to learn a little bit about it too. So I hope so, and it's certainly enlightening to think about how all of this fits into the other overall problems of our, global warming, and how we're going to adjust to global warming or prevent it by using these technologies and even this food.